There's a particular kind of silence that most people misread entirely. Not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of having said too much before and watching it fall on deaf ears. You know this silence if you've lived it. The kind that settles in after you've explained yourself clearly, vulnerably, honestly, and still somehow ended up more misunderstood than before you opened your mouth. The kind that shows up after disappointment compounds itself enough times that your nervous system starts making calculations you're not even consciously aware of. After being met with blank stares when you thought you were being clear. After watching your words get twisted into shapes you don't recognize. After realizing that the cost of being honest in certain spaces is higher than the cost of disappearing. From the outside, this reads as withdrawal, as emotional unavailability, as someone who doesn't care enough to engage, to fight, to show up. And that misreading is precisely the problem, because what's actually happening underneath is something far more complex and far more human. This isn't indifference. This is protection operating at a level most people never think to examine. This is a nervous system that has learned through direct experience that certain forms of openness lead to certain forms of harm. And once that lesson gets encoded deeply enough, silence stops being a choice you make and starts being a reflex you live with. In clinical terms, we'd call this emotional withdrawal, a pattern of self-protection where someone pulls back from relational engagement to avoid anticipated emotional pain. But that description, while technically accurate, misses the texture of the experience. It misses the internal battle, the awareness that you're doing it, the frustration at your own inability to override it even when you want to. It misses the fact that withdrawal isn't about not feeling. It's about feeling too much in an environment that hasn't proven it can handle what you're carrying. At some point, usually earlier than most people realize, being open stopped working. Vulnerability didn't create intimacy, it created exposure. Honesty didn't build trust, it built opportunities for misunderstanding. Emotional expression didn't lead to connection. It led to conflict, dismissal, or worse, that particular kind of silence that tells you the other person has already decided what you mean before you've finished explaining what you feel. So the system, in its quiet intelligence, started making adjustments, not dramatic ones, not conscious declarations of "I'm never opening up again," just small recalibrations, a slight hesitation before speaking, a decision to share less, a growing awareness that certain topics, certain feelings, certain truths are better kept internal because the external world hasn't demonstrated that it knows what to do with them. This is where most people get the analysis exactly backwards. They see someone going quiet and assume emotional absence, assume disengagement, assume the person has nothing happening beneath the surface. In reality, silence of this kind is almost always the opposite. It's not absence of emotion, it's abundance of emotion with nowhere safe to put it. It's not lack of depth, it's depth that learned to stay hidden because depth, when exposed carelessly, becomes a liability. The quiet person isn't empty, they're full, sometimes painfully, overwhelmingly full. But they've learned that pouring that fullness out into spaces that can't contain it only creates mess. So they contain it themselves. And the effort of that containment, the daily work of holding everything inside while appearing calm on the surface, that's what people miss when they mistake silence for simplicity. Because silence isn't weakness, it's not coldness, it's not even necessarily avoidance, though it can look like all three. Silence, in this context, is a form of intelligence, an adaptation made under conditions that didn't offer better options. A nervous system choosing the least harmful path available when all the paths involve some degree of pain. It's protection over exposure, containment over explanation, dignity over being misread one more time. And once you understand that, once you see silence not as absence but as response, the entire framework shifts. The question stops being, why won't they just talk, and becomes, what did they experience that taught them not to? Here's what most people don't understand about emotional withdrawal. It wasn't the first strategy. Nobody begins life believing their feelings are inconvenient or their voice doesn't matter. That belief system gets built slowly, brick by brick, through experiences that often seem minor in isolation but compound into something significant over time. It starts in moments that don't announce themselves as formative. A child expressing fear and being told there's nothing to be afraid of, instead of being helped to understand the fear itself. A teenager sharing excitement and watching it get dismissed or minimized. An adult explaining pain and being met with defensiveness instead of curiosity. None of these moments alone creates the pattern, but enough of them, in close enough succession, begin to teach something fundamental about what happens when you make yourself known. The lesson isn't taught explicitly. No one sits you down and says your feelings are a burden, so please learn to suppress them. Instead, the lesson comes through outcome. You speak, and tension rises. You express need, and you're told you're too demanding. You name hurt, and you're informed you're too sensitive. You offer vulnerability, and it gets used against you later. These aren't always dramatic betrayals. Sometimes they're just subtle dismissals, a change of subject, a failure to follow up, a response that makes it clear the other person wasn't really listening, just waiting for their turn to talk. And each time this happens, your system takes note, not in words, in wiring, in the slow adjustment of expectation. Over time, a calculation forms. If being honest creates more problems than it solves, if vulnerability opens you up to harm more often than it opens you up to connection, then maybe the safer bet is to stay closed. This isn't conscious strategy, at least not at first. It's adaptive learning. The same mechanism that teaches you not to touch hot stoves teaches you not to be emotionally available in contexts that have proven themselves unsafe. And just like you don't need to think about avoiding hot stoves once you've learned that lesson, you don't need to consciously decide to withdraw. It becomes automatic, reflexive. The body remembers what the mind might prefer to forget. This pattern gets established most powerfully in childhood, in family systems where emotions were treated as inconvenient interruptions rather than valid experiences deserving attention, in homes where the question "what's wrong" was less an invitation to share and more an accusation that something was wrong with you for feeling it, in environments where the emotional climate was so unpredictable that the safest strategy was to stay small, stay quiet, and learn to manage everything internally, because external support was either absent or actively harmful. But it doesn't only happen in childhood. Adults learn this too, in relationships where their partner responds to vulnerability with withdrawal of their own, or worse, with weaponizing what was shared, in workplaces where expressing difficulty is treated as weakness, in friendships where emotional reciprocity only flows one direction, in any context where being real has consistently led to being hurt. The adjustment happens gradually. First, you stop sharing the big things, the fears, the dreams, the pain that cuts deepest. You keep those to yourself because past experience has shown they won't be held carefully. Then you stop sharing the medium things, daily frustrations, small disappointments, moments of confusion or doubt, because even those, you've learned, can become ammunition or annoyance. Eventually, you're only sharing the surface, the acceptable emotions, the easy conversations, the version of yourself that requires nothing from others and costs you everything to maintain. And here's the cruelest part. Once you've learned to operate this way, once silence has become your primary mode of self-protection, even safe people start to look dangerous. Because your system isn't evaluating them based on who they are. It's evaluating them based on what it learned to expect from everyone else. So you stay quiet even when you don't need to, even when part of you wants to speak, because the conditioning runs deeper than conscious choice. What looks like withdrawal later in life, what appears as someone being closed off or emotionally unavailable, is often just the echo of much earlier moments. Moments where a younger version of you reached out and got nothing back, or worse, got hurt. And that version of you is still in there, still protecting you the only way it knew how, by going quiet, by staying small, by making sure that if pain is coming, it won't be because you made yourself vulnerable enough to let it in. If you've ever tried to explain emotional withdrawal to someone who's never experienced it, you've probably run into the same wall. They tell you to just communicate, just say what you're feeling, just open up, as if the problem is ignorance of the solution rather than a nervous system that has learned at a physiological level that the solution itself is dangerous. Because here's what they're missing. For many people who go quiet, silence isn't a decision made by the thinking brain. It's a response initiated by the survival brain, the part of you that operates below conscious awareness, monitoring for threat, running pattern recognition against everything you've ever experienced, making split-second calculations about safety. Most people are familiar with fight or flight, the two responses that show up when your system detects danger and believes it can either defend itself or escape. But there's a third response, one that activates when fighting seems futile and running seems impossible: freeze. And freeze is where silence lives. Freeze happens when your nervous system reads the situation as threatening but sees no viable way to fight back or get out. So it does the only thing left: it shuts down. Energy drops, movement stops. Speech becomes difficult or impossible. Not because you lack thoughts or feelings, but because expressing them would require a level of safety your body doesn't register in that moment. This is why so many people describe the exact same phenomenon. They know what they want to say. They can articulate it perfectly in their mind. They might even rehearse it, plan it, prepare for it. But the moment they try to speak, something happens. The throat closes. Words vanish. It feels like hitting a wall from the inside. And no amount of willpower or intention can override it, because this isn't happening at the level of choice. This is nervous system override. In freeze, your body prioritizes survival over expression. It reads emotional vulnerability as threat. It interprets potential conflict as danger. And it responds the way it's wired to respond when danger appears and escape isn't available: by shutting down, by going still, by containing everything internally where at least it can be monitored and controlled. This response makes perfect evolutionary sense in contexts of physical threat. If you're facing a predator and you can't fight it or outrun it, freezing might save your life. But here's the problem. The same mechanism that evolved to protect you from predators also activates in relational contexts, because your nervous system doesn't distinguish between physical danger and emotional danger. It just registers threat. And if your relational history has taught it that, emotional expression leads to harm, misunderstanding, dismissal, or attack, then expression itself becomes coded as threat. So when someone asks why you can't just talk about it, they're asking you to override a survival response with conscious intention. And that's not how survival responses work. You can't think your way out of freeze any more than you can think your way out of a panic attack. The system has already decided that the situation is unsafe, and until safety is established, not assumed, not hoped for, but actually demonstrated through consistent non-threatening response, the system will continue choosing silence, because silence, in the logic of freeze, is the least dangerous option. It doesn't escalate conflict. It doesn't expose vulnerability. It doesn't create opportunities for your words to be twisted or your feelings to be minimized. It keeps you contained, controlled, and protected from the kind of harm your system remembers, even if your conscious mind wishes it could forget. And here's the part that often gets missed entirely. Freeze isn't just learned in dramatic situations. You don't need to experience overt abuse or extreme neglect to develop this pattern. Chronic misunderstanding is enough. Repeated dismissal is enough. A relationship where your emotions were treated as inconvenient, where your attempts to communicate were met with defensiveness or shutdown, where you slowly learned that being honest just made things worse. That's enough. Your nervous system doesn't need trauma in the capital sense. It just needs consistent evidence that expression equals danger. And once that evidence accumulates, freeze becomes the default. Not because you're broken, but because your system is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect you, even if the cost of that protection is isolation. One of the most isolating aspects of emotional withdrawal is how invisible the experience is. From the outside, a quiet person can appear calm, detached maybe, even content in their silence. What no one sees is the constant noise happening internally. Because silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It usually means everything is happening, just without an exit point. People who withdraw emotionally often have the most active inner worlds you could imagine. They're not checked out, they're hypervigilant. Not disengaged, they're overengaged, just entirely within themselves. There's a conversation running at all times, analyzing what was said, what wasn't said, what was meant versus what was heard, replaying interactions sometimes for days, looking for what went wrong or what could have gone differently, rehearsing responses that will never be delivered, constructing explanations that will never be shared, imagining confrontations that will never happen because the risk of them going badly is too high. This isn't rumination in the pathological sense, though it can certainly become that. Often it's just processing, the kind of processing that would normally happen in conversation and back-and-forth dialogue, in relational repair. But when that external processing isn't available, when it doesn't feel safe, it all has to happen inside, alone, without feedback, without correction, without the relief of being heard. The irony is that these are often people with exceptional emotional intelligence. They understand their feelings with precision. They can name them, trace their origins, identify their triggers. They know exactly why they're upset, exactly what they need, exactly what would help. The problem isn't insight. The problem is that insight lives in a vacuum. It never gets tested in relationship. It never gets the validation of being understood by another person. It never becomes dialogue. So it stays monologue. And monologues, no matter how accurate, don't create connection. The inner world becomes both refuge and prison. It's the place where you can be fully honest, because there's no one there to misunderstand you. But it's also the place where you're completely alone, because there's no one there to understand you either. And that duality creates a particular kind of exhaustion. You're constantly working, constantly processing, constantly carrying the full weight of your emotional experience, without distribution, without support, without the regulation that comes from being truly met by another nervous system. What people on the outside interpret as low emotional expression is often actually emotional suppression under significant pressure. The person isn't feeling less. They're managing more. They're holding everything, sorting everything, containing everything while presenting a surface that gives nothing away. And that takes enormous energy. It's why withdrawn people often seem fine until they're suddenly not, until something small tips the scale and everything that's been held internally comes flooding out in ways that seem disproportionate to whatever triggered it. But it's not disproportionate. It's proportionate to everything that's been building underneath. Every unspoken hurt, every swallowed frustration, every moment of feeling unseen, all of it compressed into silence until silence can't hold it anymore. This is why telling someone to just express themselves misses the point so completely. They are expressing themselves, constantly, just not externally. The expression is happening, it's detailed, it's articulate, it's often painfully clear, it's just directed inward, because outward has proven too costly. And until that cost changes, until expression can happen without the fear of being misread, dismissed, or hurt, the inner world will stay loud, and the outer world will stay quiet. Not because the person lacks the ability to speak, but because they've learned through relentless experience that some things are safer left unsaid. There's a specific pain that keeps silence in place long after it's stopped being necessary. And that pain isn't fear of conflict, it's fear of being misunderstood. Because conflict ends. Misunderstanding lingers. Conflict is loud, visible, something you can point to and say this is the problem. But misunderstanding is insidious. It rewrites who you are in someone else's perception. It takes your intentions and translates them into something unrecognizable. It makes you responsible for interpretations you never intended and meanings you never communicated. And once you've been on the receiving end of that enough times, once you've watched your words get twisted and your feelings get reframed and your character get misread, silence starts to feel like the only way to maintain any control over how you're perceived. At least if you stay quiet, you can't be misquoted. If you don't explain, your explanation can't be misunderstood. If you don't share your feelings, those feelings can't be minimized or invalidated. There's a dark logic to it. Silence protects you from the specific harm of being known incorrectly. Because being unknown is painful, yes, but being misknown is worse. Being unknown leaves possibility. The door hasn't closed. The other person simply doesn't have the information yet. But being misknown means the door closed on a false version of you. It means you showed up, you tried, and what registered on the other end wasn't you at all. It was a distortion. And now you're left trying to correct a misperception that may be more entrenched than no perception would have been. This is why people who withdraw often report the same experience. They don't mind being alone. What they can't tolerate is being with someone and still feeling alone, being in conversation and still feeling unheard, being vulnerable and still feeling unseen. Because that kind of relational disconnection is more painful than isolation. At least isolation is honest. You know where you stand. But disconnection within connection creates a unique kind of confusion and hurt. You did everything you were supposed to do. You opened. You explained. You tried. And it still didn't work. That failure doesn't just hurt. It teaches. It teaches that the problem might not be solvable through more communication. It teaches that some people, no matter how clearly you speak, will hear something else. And once that lesson settles in, silence becomes the most rational response available. The trade-off becomes clear. You can risk being misunderstood, or you can guarantee being unseen. And for many people, being unseen is the safer bet. Because invisibility doesn't escalate. It doesn't create conflict. It doesn't give anyone ammunition. It doesn't lead to arguments about what you meant versus what they heard. It's clean, controlled, manageable. The pain of it is dull and constant, but it's predictable. And after enough unpredictability, predictable pain starts to look like stability. This is the trap. Silence protects you from one kind of hurt while locking you into another. It prevents the acute pain of being misread while creating the chronic pain of never being read at all. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to tell which is worse, because you've adapted to the chronic pain. You've learned to live with. It's become background noise. But the acute pain, the pain of trying and failing to be understood, that still feels unbearable. So you stay quiet, not because you prefer it, but because the alternative has proven, again and again, to be worse. If you've ever known someone who withdraws emotionally, you've probably noticed something confusing. They're not consistently distant. They fluctuate. One day they're warm, present, engaged. They'll talk for hours, laugh easily, show up fully. Then, seemingly without warning, they go quiet, distant, unreachable. And from the outside, this inconsistency reads as game playing, as manipulation, as someone who can't make up their mind about whether they want connection or not. But that reading misses what's actually happening. This isn't inconsistency. It's capacity. And capacity fluctuates in ways that have nothing to do with how much the person cares. For someone who has learned to self-regulate through withdrawal, being open is work, not in a resentful sense, just in an energetic sense. It requires resources. Emotional bandwidth, a nervous system that feels stable enough to stay vulnerable without collapsing. On good days, when they're rested, when stress is manageable, when their system feels resourced, they have that capacity. They can be present, they can engage, they can even be the most emotionally available person in the room. But that availability has a cost, and the cost compounds over time. Extended interaction, even positive interaction, drains the battery. Emotional exposure, even safe emotional exposure, requires recovery. And if they don't get that recovery, if they push past their capacity because they're trying to show up or because they don't want to disappoint, the system eventually forces the issue. It withdraws whether they want it to or not. This is why the distance often comes after closeness, not because the closeness was fake, but because the closeness was expensive, and the price gets paid later in the form of needing to retreat, to go internal, to stop engaging for a while. It's not personal. It's not punishment. It's regulation. The nervous system protecting itself from overload the only way it knows how. But without understanding that mechanism, the other person just sees inconsistency. They see someone who was warm yesterday and cold today, someone who seemed interested last week and unavailable this week, and they make the natural assumption that something changed in how the person feels about them, when the truth is, nothing changed in feeling. What changed was capacity. The withdrawn person still cares, still values the relationship, still wants connection. They just can't maintain it continuously without breaks. And if those breaks aren't respected, if they're interpreted as rejection or lack of interest, it creates exactly the kind of misunderstanding that makes withdrawal feel even more necessary. Because now they're not just managing their own internal state, they're managing someone else's interpretation of their internal state. They're explaining themselves, defending themselves, trying to make the other person understand that the distance isn't personal, while simultaneously not having the energy to engage in that explanation. It becomes a loop. The more they need space, the more the other person pushes for reassurance. The more they're pushed, the more they need to withdraw to manage the pressure. And round it goes until the withdrawal that started as temporary self-regulation becomes permanent relational distance. This is the part most people miss. What looks like someone going hot and cold, someone who can't decide what they want, is usually someone operating at the edge of their nervous system's tolerance. They're not playing games, they're trying to stay regulated. And they're doing it in a world that expects consistent availability, that treats needing space as rejection, that doesn't account for the fact that some people need to oscillate between connection and solitude just to function. The warmth isn't an act, the distance isn't manipulation. Both are real, both are necessary. And the person living this pattern is often just as frustrated by it as anyone else, because they feel the inconsistency too. They see themselves pull back and wish they didn't have to. They want to be the person who can stay open, stay available, stay engaged, but their system won't let them. Not because it's broken, but because it knows what happens when capacity is exceeded. When you push past your limits, you don't just get tired, you destabilize. And for someone whose primary fear is losing control of their emotional state, destabilization is the thing to avoid at all costs, even if the cost is looking inconsistent. Even if the cost is being misunderstood as someone who doesn't care. Because they do care, often too much. And that's exactly why they have to retreat. Here's the thing about protective strategies. What keeps you safe in one season of life can become what keeps you stuck in another. Emotional withdrawal begins as intelligent adaptation, as a nervous system doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is minimize harm. And in environments where openness genuinely isn't safe, where vulnerability leads to pain, where expression invites misunderstanding or attack, withdrawal works. It reduces damage, it preserves dignity, it keeps you intact when staying open would break you. The problem is that protective strategies don't automatically turn off when circumstances change. They become default, reflexive, part of how you operate in the world. So even when safe people appear, even when contexts shift, even when the original danger is no longer present, the protection stays active. Because your nervous system isn't evaluating the present moment independently. It's layering the present over every past experience that taught it to be careful. This is where withdrawal starts to cost more than it protects. At first, the costs are subtle. Conversations that stay surface level, relationships that never quite deepen, a growing sense that people know you but don't really know you. These things are easy to rationalize. You tell yourself you're private, that you don't need deep connection, that you're fine on your own, and maybe you are fine, But fine isn't the same as fulfilled, and over time the gap between the two starts to show, because humans aren't wired for isolation, we're wired for connection, and when connection is chronically limited, even by choice, something inside starts to ache. Not always loudly, not always obviously, but persistently, the kind of ache that shows up as vague dissatisfaction, as loneliness even when you're around people, as the sense that something's missing, but you can't quite name what. The deeper cost is this. When you protect yourself by limiting access, you don't just keep pain out, you keep intimacy out too. Real intimacy requires being known, actually known. Not the edited version you present to stay safe, but the full version, the complicated, contradictory, still figuring it out version, and that version can't be known if it's never shared. So withdrawal, even when it feels necessary, creates the very isolation it's meant to protect you from. You stay safe from being hurt, but you also stay separate from being held, separate from being understood, separate from the kind of connection that requires risk, but offers something silence can't, the possibility of being seen fully and accepted anyway. And perhaps the cruelest irony is this. The longer you stay withdrawn, the harder it becomes to change course. Expression starts to feel foreign. Vulnerability feels terrifying. Even when you want to open up, even when you recognize safe people, your system doesn't register safety as an invitation. It registers it as a trap, because safety is what you thought you had before. Safety is what you believed in until it hurt you. So safety itself becomes suspect. And the walls that were supposed to be temporary become permanent, not because you chose isolation, but because the mechanism that was supposed to protect you until things got better never learned how to recognize better when it arrived. Needs go unspoken. Boundaries stay implicit, resentments accumulate, and all of it gets managed internally because asking still feels more dangerous than carrying. You tell yourself you're independent, self-sufficient, that you don't need help. And maybe in some ways that's true, but independence taken too far becomes isolation. And isolation, no matter how well managed, is still a form of suffering. The prison isn't built from bars. It's built from adaptation, from a strategy that was never meant to last forever but somehow became the structure of your relational life. And without intervention, without conscious choice to test new patterns, that structure stays. Not because it's serving you, but because it's familiar. And familiar, even when it hurts, still feels safer than the unknown risk of letting someone in. If healing from emotional withdrawal could be summarized in a single shift, it would be this: learning to recognize the difference between past danger and present possibility. Because the core issue isn't that you're incapable of openness. It's that your system associates openness with harm. And until that association is updated, until your nervous system has evidence that expression can lead somewhere other than pain, withdrawal will continue to feel like the most rational choice available. This is why telling someone to just open up is useless at best and harmful at worst. It doesn't address the actual problem. The problem isn't lack of willingness, it's lack of safety, or more accurately, lack of registered safety. Because there's a difference between a situation being objectively safe and your nervous system recognizing it as safe. And that recognition doesn't happen through logic. It happens through experience, through repeated, consistent, non-threatening interactions that slowly teach your system a new pattern. Safety in this context is very specific. It's not just the absence of overt harm. It's the presence of certain qualities. Being listened to without interruption or correction. Being asked about rather than assumed about. Being given space to find your words without being rushed. Being met with curiosity instead of defensiveness when you express something difficult. Being allowed to be uncertain, to contradict yourself, to not have everything figured out without that being used against you. These are the conditions that allow a nervous system to start relaxing its guard, not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, a little less braced, a little less vigilant, a little more willing to test whether expression might lead somewhere different this time. And here's what most people don't realize. Safety doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one day and suddenly feel safe enough to be vulnerable. It builds slowly, through small moments that might seem insignificant in isolation but compound into something meaningful over time. A conversation where you said something difficult and the other person didn't make it about themselves. A conflict that got resolved through listening instead of escalation. A moment of vulnerability that was met with care instead of judgment. Each of these moments is data, evidence that maybe, possibly, this situation is different from what your system learned to expect. And with enough evidence, the system starts to update its programming. But this process requires patience, both from you and from anyone trying to connect with you. Because the timeline isn't linear. You won't steadily become more open. You'll fluctuate. You'll have moments of progress followed by moments of retreat. Days where vulnerability feels possible, and days where it feels unbearable. And that's not failure. That's how nervous system rewiring works. It tests new patterns carefully. It doesn't abandon old protections until it's sure the new approach is actually safer. So there will be steps forward and steps back, moments where you open up and moments where you shut down. And all of that is part of the process, not evidence that the process isn't working. What you're looking for isn't perfection. It's not the ability to be constantly vulnerable or endlessly expressive. What you're looking for is choice. The ability to recognize when you're staying quiet because you want to and when you're staying quiet because you're afraid. When silence is serving you and when it's limiting you. When withdrawal is regulation and when it's reflex. That discernment, that awareness, is where healing actually lives. Because once you can see the pattern, once you can feel the difference between protective silence and chosen silence, you create space for something new. Not forced vulnerability, not performance of openness, but genuine moments where you test whether it's safe to be real and discover that sometimes, with the right people, in the right conditions, it actually is. The goal isn't to stop being someone who sometimes needs to withdraw. The goal is to stop being someone who can only withdraw. To build enough flexibility in your system that protection is one option among many, not the only option available. And that kind of flexibility doesn't come from pushing yourself to speak when every fiber of your being is screaming to stay quiet. It comes from finding contexts where speaking feels less dangerous, where the risk of being misunderstood is lower, where even if things go wrong, you trust that repair is possible. Those contexts are where healing happens, not in grand gestures of vulnerability, but in small moments of being met well, again and again, until your system starts to believe that maybe, just maybe, silence isn't the only way to stay safe anymore. If you recognized yourself in any of this, in the withdrawal, the silence, the careful distance you keep, there's something you need to hear that probably no one has said to you clearly enough. You're not broken. You're not damaged. You didn't fail at being human. You adapted. What looks like dysfunction is actually your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is protect you from harm, based on the information it has available. And if the information it has is that openness leads to pain, then silence makes perfect sense, not as a permanent solution, but as an intelligent response to conditions that weren't safe enough for anything else. The fact that you're here, listening to this, thinking about these patterns, means something. It means part of you recognizes that the protection that once served you might now be limiting you, that the walls that kept pain out are also keeping connection out, and that recognition, that willingness to even consider whether something might need to shift, that's already the beginning of change. Because you can't change what you can't see. And most people never get to the point of seeing their own patterns clearly enough to question them. They just live them, assume they're fixed, assume this is just how they are. But you're different. You're here because some part of you knows that withdrawal was learned, and what was learned can be updated. This doesn't mean you need to become someone you're not. You don't need to transform into an extroverted, endlessly expressive, always available person. That's not what healing looks like. Healing looks like having options, being able to choose silence when it serves you, and choose expression when that serves you better. Being able to recognize safe people when they appear and actually let them in. Being able to risk vulnerability in contexts where the risk is worth it because the possibility of real connection outweighs the fear of being misunderstood. That's the work, not becoming more, just becoming freer, less bound by patterns that made sense once but don't fit anymore. And if you're wondering where to start here. Start by noticing. Notice when you go quiet and what triggers it. Notice when you want to speak but don't and what stops you. Notice when withdrawal feels like choice and when it feels like compulsion. You don't have to change any of it yet. Just notice, because awareness creates space, and space is where change becomes possible. Not through force, not through willpower, but through gentle, consistent attention to patterns that have been running in the background for so long you stopped questioning them. You deserve to be known, actually known, not the version of you that stays safe by staying hidden, but the real version, the one with needs and fears and contradictions, the one who sometimes doesn't have it all figured out, the one who still carries hurt from times when being open went badly. That version of you deserves to exist in relationship, not just in your own head. And finding people who can hold that version with care, who can meet your vulnerability without weaponizing it, who can sit with your complexity without needing to fix it or simplify it, those people exist. They're rare, but they exist, and they're worth the risk of looking for. This isn't a call to suddenly bare your soul to everyone. It's an invitation to consider that maybe, possibly, with the right people, in the right conditions, silence isn't the only option anymore. That maybe you've learned enough, protected yourself well enough, survived enough, that you're ready to test whether something different is possible. Not because withdrawal was wrong, but because you're not in the same danger you once were. And your system, brilliant as it is, sometimes needs help recognizing when the threat has passed, and it's safe to try something new. If this resonated with you, if any part of this felt like it was describing your experience, you're not alone. There are more people living this pattern than you realize. They're just quiet about it. Which makes sense, given everything we've talked about. But that silence can be lonely. And one of the most powerful antidotes to that loneliness is simply knowing that other people understand, that your experience isn't strange or shameful or evidence of weakness. It's human. It's what happens when sensitive people meet harsh conditions and do their best to survive. You did survive, and that's worth acknowledging. What comes next is up to you.